Well, good morning, everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today. It's also a great pleasure to be in Poland, first time, so I'm very excited about that. So I'm going to talk to you about the regulation of artificial intelligence, some themes within that, and in particular, I'm going to focus on three distinct issues. The first issue is the plurality of values that have to underlie the regulation of AI. So the idea is there are plural values that are relevant when we're trying to regulate this transformative technology. The second theme is going to be the role of democracy. How do we translate those values into effective, legitimate regulation? And the answer I'm going to suggest is there has to be a great deal of democratic participation. And finally, I'm going to conclude with some thoughts about the role that universities can play in this context. Now, sadly, unlike the other speakers, I'm not going to have cool graphics to show you, so I'm really going to be testing your patience and your attention. So let's begin with the theme of pluralism. So regulation is about establishing rules, it's about establishing policies, it's about establishing structures that better enable us to achieve our values. And we typically have a large array of values. And really effective regulation enables us to achieve these values very often without having to think about the values. So for example, when we're driving, we want to get to somewhere quickly, but we also want to get there safely. They're the relevant values. But we don't want to be thinking about those values. Instead, we follow basic rules, like drive on the left. If you drive on the left, in England at least, you'll be driving safely, other things being equal. So generally, we don't have to think about values because we can rely on existing structures, existing rules. But the problem that arises with AI is that it's such a novel and potentially radically transformative technology that we can't simply assume that existing regulation is going to be effective. We have to therefore go back to the underlying values. Why do we have to go back to these underlying values? Basically for two reasons. One, because AI requires us to rethink some of our existing rules. And secondly, because AI may require new rules. So take the first possibility, rethink existing rules. We have existing rules that strongly protect privacy and strongly protect the ability of people to access your personal data. But what if it's the case that AI technology, driven by big data, can massively increase the quality of healthcare, can massively drive improved health outcomes? Should we now reconsider the rules and say, actually, maybe we should have less restrictive privacy rules in order to enable these better health outcomes? So we're forced to rethink existing rules in light of a new configuration of values made possible by technology. Alternatively, more radical possibility, we may have to think about new rules that didn't exist before. So one example is this. One of the most momentous things about artificial intelligence is that it does something that only in the past humans could do, which is basically reach a decision. Now, one question arises, are there some decisions that we shouldn't allow AI to make? Another version of this question, is there a human right to a human decision in certain areas? Is it okay, for example, for an AI judge to sentence you to prison? Or do we want to say that's the sort of decision that always has to be made by a human being? Is it okay for an autonomous weapons system to make the decision to kill a soldier? Or do we want to say matters of life and death cannot be something that a non-human gets to decide? We never had to think about that question before, because there was never any real capability of delegating those decisions to a non-human agent. So, another aspect here, of course, is that AI is what I'm going to call a totalizing technology. It has potentially radical implications for the whole of human life, from personal relations, people falling in love with robots or deciding to marry them, to the law, as we've talked about, to warfare, to the health sector, to people using robots to teach their children or look after their aged mothers. Across the whole spectrum of human activity, AI potentially is going to be playing an important role. And what that means is there are probably no values that we have that are not potentially affected by AI. So we need to think about the nature of these values that we care about. So the first theme I want to stress is this theme of value pluralism. So this is a view about value that not everyone agrees with, but I think is the correct starting point for thinking about the regulation of AI. So what is value pluralism? So this is a philosophical thesis about the nature of value, and we can divide it into 3 claims. So the first claim is there isn't one thing that we value ultimately. Like some people think the only thing we really value is pleasure. So the right thing to do is always whatever will increase your pleasure. I think those sorts of views must think there are multiple things that we value. We value justice, we value beauty, we value courage, we value loyalty, we value friendship. So there are multiple values, and they can't be reduced to one thing. That's the first claim. And the second claim is these multiple values, in particular situations, sometimes come into conflict. Sometimes there's a conflict, for example, if you're a judge, between giving a just sentence and giving a merciful sentence. Or sometimes there might be a conflict between loyalty to your country and loyalty to your family. Famous example by Jean-Paul Sartre. So there are not just multiple values, but these values can come into conflict. They can create dilemmas. And there's the question, how do I resolve these conflicts? That's the second claim. And the third claim is a bit more radical. The third claim is sometimes there isn't a single correct answer to how to resolve these conflicts. So let me give you a mundane example. You're thinking about your future career, and you have an array of options before you. Should I study to be a lawyer? Should I study to do medicine? Should I become a musician? Think about the values you will consider in making that decision. Probably you'll want to have a job that you enjoy, because enjoyment is a value. But you also want a job that maybe makes a social contribution, makes other people's lives better. You also want a job that's challenging, intellectually challenging, maybe physically challenging. You also want a job where friendships can emerge doing that job. And there are many other considerations. Now, the claim I'm making is, if you take all these considerations into account and try to balance them, it's very unlikely you will come to the conclusion, there is only one job, professor of philosophy at Oxford, that is the best job for me, and all other jobs are inferior to that job. Very likely, there's going to be a range of jobs. Sure, some jobs will be excluded. If you say, I want to be an assassin, no, that's going to be excluded for obvious reasons. But there will be a bounded range of jobs. So the thought is this: because there's a plurality of values, sometimes when we make rational decisions, there isn't a single optimal decision. There's rather an array of possible decisions, and that means this is very important for human freedom. We can express our individual character by choosing one or other of these options. So someone expresses their character by choosing to be a musician. Another person expresses their character by choosing to be a surgeon. But it wasn't because being a surgeon was clearly better than being a musician or vice versa. So this is the kind of pluralist view that I think we should have in mind. So why am I stressing it? The reason I stress it is because often when people say we should use AI tools, they ignore this pluralism. Pluralism makes decision-making difficult because you have to balance different values. AI, and the machine learning version, operates on the basis of maximizing a particular objective function. The function might be something like increase profitability, increase the attention a tweet receives, etc. So here's an example. You're a judge, and you have to make a decision about bail. Bail is someone has been charged with a crime, and you have to decide, should they be kept in custody, kept in prison, or should they be allowed to go home until the day of the trial? You have to make this important decision. Can AI help you? Well, there are some legal scholars who say AI tools can be very helpful here because AI tools are better than humans in making the decision whether someone should be released on bail. Why are they better? Well, the claim is they're better because they're better able to predict, is this person likely to offend if I release them on bail? Apparently, human judges are biased. They're too influenced by the nature of the existing charge against the offender and don't take into sufficient account their history. But here's the point I want to make to you. When you're considering whether to release someone charged with an offense on bail, is the only thing you look at the likelihood that they will reoffend? Or do you look at other things? Do you look at the severity of the crime they've been charged with? Because you might think it's way worse if someone charged with a very serious offense absconds than someone charged with a minor offense. Do you look at the impact it might have on their family? Maybe they have small children who will be very badly affected if they're put in prison, awaiting trial. So my thought is as follows. The real decision about bail requires you to balance a number of considerations. But the people who adopt the view, they're very enthusiastic about using AI tools to solve that problem, reduce the question to one value. Is this person likely to reoffend? And I think this is a really sobering example, because the problem is this. In order to use, instead of using AI tools to solve our problems, we change our problems so that we can use the tools, right? We change the bail decision into a decision about, is this person likely to reoffend? Because that way, it's easier to use the tool. So what should be driving what we do? The tools or our problems? AI is a tool, but it mustn't dictate for us what the nature of our problem is. And I think pluralism is very important in understanding some of the limitations of AI. So, in this context, what I've been doing is, well, a number of things. One thing is I've engaged with one of the world's leading computer scientists, Ye-Jin Choi. She's a professor at the University of Washington. And we've developed a system that tries to reflect this pluralism. Ye-Jin had previously created an AI system called Delphi, where you can ask it your moral dilemmas, like, should I lie to my boss about X? And it will give you an answer. But what this other system that we've developed does is that it doesn't try to answer your questions, but rather it tells you the relevant ethical considerations raised by those questions. So it highlights the plurality of issues that that questioner raises, the different values that are implicated. Another thing that I'm doing is trying to bring in the voice of the ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. And we're having this remarkable event in Athens, June 20th. The event will take place right next door to the site of Aristotle's ancient school, the Lyceum. And one of the reasons we're engaging with Aristotle is because we think Aristotle, as an ancient thinker, was more attuned to the plurality of human goods than many modern thinkers, especially modern thinkers who are influential in AI, who try to reduce all these goods to one type of consideration. All this might sound quite philosophical, but I think it has serious real-world implications, because the truth about philosophy is we pretty much all operate with a philosophy, but often we're unconscious about what that philosophy is. There's an excellent book that was written last year called Digital Empires by the legal scholar Anu Bradford. And she says there are 3 great digital empires in the world, and they're engaged in a struggle to control the regulation of artificial intelligence and digital technology. The empires are China, the United States, and the European Union. And she further makes the point that these 3 empires are driven by very different ideologies, very different views about value when they try to regulate AI. So the Chinese approach, she says, is a kind of state-driven approach. The state controls everything, it's highly authoritarian, it's very top-down. The American approach is a market-driven approach. It's resistant to regulation of AI. It tries to promote market-based innovation in order to generate wealth through AI. And the European approach, she says, is a rights-based approach. And you see this with the EU's recent AI Act. The AI Act has a tiered approach to the regulation of AI systems. The level of regulation depends upon the level of risk these systems involve. So high-risk systems have more stringent regulation, low-risk systems, no regulation or simply regulation through a voluntary code. But risk is defined largely by risk to rights. So it's a rights-based system. I think all 3 of these approaches are wrong. And pluralism shows us why they're wrong. If you think about the Chinese system, clearly there's a lack of emphasis on the value of human autonomy. So there's no emphasis on the autonomy of citizens coming together as free and equal citizens to reach democratic decisions. But there is also insufficient emphasis on freedom in one's personal life. Think about the way, for example, China uses AI technology to socially score their citizens. So whether you are able to do something like travel abroad or check into certain hotels depends upon the score you're given by surveillance technology that checks whether you've been a good boy or girl. Okay, that's an easy case. What about the Americans and the market-driven approach? Why should we value free markets? Answer, because they're a good mechanism for creating wealth. But the problem is, as Aristotle said, wealth itself is not an ultimate value. Wealth is only instrumentally valuable for the good things that it can bring about. So it's never going to be an answer to the question, what's the ultimate goal that you're pursuing here in regulating AI, to say we want to increase the amount of wealth. 1, wealth itself isn't a value. 2, simply increasing the total amount of wealth doesn't tell me how this wealth is distributed. And there are important issues, including rights-based issues, about the distribution of wealth. The 3rd approach is the European Union's approach. It's meant to be rights-based. I've written about why, if you believe in rights, you still might have a serious problem with the AI Act. But here's the problem with the rights-based approach. Rights are not enough. Think about the question, should I use a robot to look after my aged mother? What questions will you ask yourself about whether you should do that? And one of the things you should ask is, well, what are the qualities that I look for in a good carer? Well, Are the qualities that I look for in the good carer simply that they respect the rights of whoever they're caring for? Isn't a good carer also kind, compassionate, playful, tolerant, patient in a way that isn't really demanded by rights? So the rights focus is dangerous because it threatens to lose sight of other values that we think are really important. So I think all of these approaches have a grain of truth in them. The state really does have a role to play. The market has a role to play, and rights have a role to play. But we need a broader, more encompassing, pluralistic framework to make that a reality and to give it compelling force. We can't have it driven exclusively by statism, by rights, or by the market. So, I've been harping on about this theme about pluralism. One implication of pluralism is that we should be very suspicious when someone says the key to regulating AI is this one concept: trust or safety. So some of you will know in November last year, the UK government held an international summit, the UK Safety Summit. And many of us, when we heard about this, were kind of disappointed because we thought, oh no, the UK government is buying into this hype that the main problem around AI is that it's going to wipe us out in some kind of robot apocalypse. Okay? I'm not discounting the possibility of an existential risk around AI, but I think it's way overhyped relative to the other risks that AI poses, more here and now risks. I mean, here's one reason why I think it's overhyped. One of the reasons people think robots might wipe us out is they become very intelligent and find unusual ways of achieving their goals, so that even if we give them a simple goal, like please create paper clips, it might decide that the most efficient way to create a lot of paper clips is to wipe out humanity for some reason. So here is the thought. It's a super intelligent AI system, but it's so stupid that it thinks it's okay to wipe out humanity in order to fulfill humanity's request to produce more paper clips. There are deep conceptual and other ethical issues in many of the stories about how AI might generate an apocalypse. And one of the pressure points, I think, is this question, but what is the notion of intelligence you're using? Because the ordinary human notion of intelligence isn't a value-free notion. The ordinary human notion of intelligence involves elements of common sense. And one of the elements of common sense is if humans give you instruction, please create some paper clips, they're not asking you to do that, even if it involves wiping out humanity. I think there are other sorts of issues that we could talk about in a broader context. In the end, what happened? In the end, at Ditchley, this UK government meeting, they produced a declaration on AI safety, but that declaration wasn't about safety. It talked about all the values. It talked about human rights. It talked about sustainability. Safety, I think of as threat to your life, protecting you from threats to your life, protecting you from threats to your limbs. This wasn't about safety in the end of the day. It was really about the pluralism of values that I talked about at the beginning. So why was safety used? It's hard to know. I suspect one reason is the UK government wanted China involved, they wanted America involved, and safety sounds like a safe, if you pardon the expression, concept to use to bring together all these different parties. Who is going to say, I'm against safety? Or some might say, I'm against human rights, or I'm against freedom, or I'm against democracy. So maybe there was a kind of rhetorical expedience there to use the concept of safety to bring together a large group of people. But there's a risk that's involved as well, which is we then start looking at AI through an excessively narrow lens. Okay, so that was the first theme that I said I would talk about, the need to have pluralistic values in our thinking about AI and not try to reduce things to one kind of value. Second theme I want to talk about is how you translate values into regulation that is effective and legitimate. And my claim is, essential to this process is democracy. And by democracy, I mean the situation where citizens who are free and equal deliberate about the common good, they come together to discuss what is in their common good, and they reach a collective decision about how to pursue the common good. Now, related to the point about safety, when you start talking about AI as a matter of safety, it becomes a technical topic. Safety sounds like the sort of topic that there are experts on. Technical experts, bureaucrats, who will devise rules that will keep us safe, ensure that the products that are developed are safe. But the regulation of AI is not a technical exercise in that way exclusively. It's an exercise that requires us to engage with questions of value. So one question of value is, why are we developing this AI tool? What good is it bringing about? And another question of value is, and what are the constraints on bringing about this good? Maybe it does bring about something valuable, but at great cost to the environment. Remember, training one large language model has the deleterious effect on the environment as two large cars over the entirety of their lifetime. Is it worth the cost? Or what about the use of personal data to secure those outcomes? Is that worth it? So an important question is, once we see the plurality of values that are involved in regulating AI, we notice a further thing. There are no experts on these values. Now, some people think that's a controversial claim. The ancient Greek philosopher thought that his school could train people who would be experts about justice. So if they did a lot of maths and a lot of philosophy, they would become experts on justice in the same way that some people are experts on nuclear physics. I think this is a mistake. I think ethical wisdom isn't something that you can have expertise in the same way that you can have expertise in nuclear physics. There is no such thing as I've got a PhD in ethical wisdom. So one implication of that is we need to mobilize a democratic public to engage with these sorts of questions. And we need to do that for two reasons. One is because historically we know that democracies produce better outcomes. There's never been a famine in a democratic society. This great discovery of the economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. Famines don't happen because of a shortage of food. They happen because information about where food is needed doesn't get circulated properly. And what ensures that information gets circulated properly is democratically accountable politicians. Another value is peace. Again, going back to the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, thesis of the democratic peace. Democratic countries tend not to go to war against each other. And human rights. The Harvard political scientist Catherine Sinkink, important recent book about human rights, says the most important thing you need if you want to secure human rights is democracy. So if we want these good outcomes, generally we're going to get them through democratic processes, and then the process itself is inherently valuable. The process of coming together as equal citizens, each having an equal say, is valuable independently of the value of the outcome that's produced. one of the big problems we're facing right now is that in these discussions about the regulation of AI, the public is being sidelined. And for me, there was no better example of this, sadly, than the interview between the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Elon Musk. That was a perfect example of the way in which the regulation of AI, this technology that threatens to have massive implications for everyone's life, is being monopolized by a governmental and technocratic elite, excluding ordinary people, often on the spurious pretext that these people are not sufficiently knowledgeable to have an opinion. But if that's what you really believe, your priority should be to give them that knowledge so that they can form a considered opinion. That might seem obvious to you, but I think there's a more radical implication, which is a lot of the most consequential decisions now about AI are not being made by governments. They're being made by a small number of large corporations. So you saw last year the debacle in OpenAI and the firing of Sam Altman. And there was a lot of murky controversy about why he was fired and what was going on there. But there's a deeper issue. OpenAI is a company that says explicitly it's developing AI for the good of humanity. Question: how can a company with a tiny board of directors, all of them with very similar backgrounds, be making decisions in an informed way about what is good for the whole of humanity? How is that possible? My claim is it's not possible, it's not realistic. So we don't have to think about simply, at a purely political level, greater citizen engagement. We have to think about restructuring the nature of corporate decision-making. So one reason, which I've already hinted at, is because these technologies have tremendous wide-scale repercussions for the lives of people, and in a sense, they're unavoidable. You can't opt out of them. They're a kind of necessary infrastructure to your life. But there's a second reason. There's a second reason, and that is, maybe you've noticed a lot of these companies now are beginning to act like governments. And this was the power of that meeting between Musk and Sunak. It looked like two heads of state meeting. It didn't look like the Prime Minister talking to a guy who owns a company. It looked like two people of equal standing. How is this manifesting itself? Well, here's one simple example. The moderation of content on social media. Facebook, Meta, gets to decide what content is taken down. It gets to decide that Donald Trump shouldn't be on the platform. This is now looking like a governance function. It's now regulating other people's behavior in the way we think only states should be able to regulate other people's behavior. But what's the condition on which states should be able to regulate other people's behavior? Arguably, one of those conditions is that they're democratically legitimate. So I think, in addition to talking about revitalizing democracy in the normal sense, I think we have to talk about how these structures of decision-making that are increasingly impactful for the rest of us, but we're insulated from, because the model that is being operated on is an old model that basically says corporations are in the business of maximizing profit. It's up to states to concern themselves with other sorts of considerations. Just as a matter of interest, how many people here have heard about the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights? Well, that's very refreshing, wonderful, because usually the answer is only one person, and that person only knows because I told them about it previously. That's fantastic. So the guiding principles, which were approved in 2011 by the United Nations, they were created largely by a great academic at Harvard called John Ruggie. And what's historic about them, two things. One is this is the first time the UN approved of a document it didn't itself create. But the second thing that's important about them is what these principles say is corporations have obligations to respect human rights independently of the law. So it's not enough for a corporation to say, yeah, we're in this country, we're using child labor to stitch our footballs, but it's okay in this country because it's legal. The claim now is you can't get away with that. Your social license to operate as a corporation depends on meeting minimal conditions. It depends on meeting human rights concerns. And you can't say, well, it's legal. Now, this is itself a transformation. It's a positive transformation about how we see the social role of the corporation. But if the social role of the corporation is to look at values beyond profit maximization, then all the more reason there should be democratic input into what's happening. So, this is a theme that I'm working on with my colleague Elaine Landmore. She's a professor of political science at Yale. She's someone who has been very innovative in thinking about how to revitalize democratic decision-making in the current age. And the views that we're gravitating towards are the following. The first is, as I've indicated, that we need to radically democratize how decisions about the development and deployment of AI are being made, and we need to inject much more participation, actual participation by informed citizens. Second claim is this, that we have to rethink the nature of democracy. We have an 18th century model of democracy, which is we vote in elections every so often. And then these representatives carry out for us the task of governing. This was not the ancient Greek model of democracy, which was much more participatory. We think we need to experiment with different forms, additional forms of democratic decision-making, whether that be citizen assemblies, whether it be what Ellen calls liquid democracy, where I give my vote to someone else who I trust, who I think knows these issues and will vote in the way that I think is correct, rather than to a professional politician. The third thing we think, and this goes back to the OpenAI example, is that we can't think of the site of democratic decision-making simply the traditional site of politics leading to the enactment of law. We have to radically democratize more generally, and I've already talked about ideas about democratizing processes in corporate decision-making, but also in the workplace, also in culture and in science. People forget that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes a right to science and culture. What does that mean? It means that I can't fully be a genuinely respected democratic citizen if I'm locked out of the process where culture is created, if I'm locked out of the process where science is created. Because think about it, democracy is about values, it's about ideas. But where do ideas and values begin? They begin in culture, they begin in science. If I'm locked out of that process, then it's too late for me to participate further down the line when others have already defined the options, because they get to write the books, they get to make the films, they get to decide which way science is going to develop. And the fourth thing I want to mention, because someone's going to say, look, isn't this incredibly utopian? The Greeks had a small society. They could engage in direct democracy. How can contemporary, large, modern societies have a more active role for their citizens? Another thing they might say, if they were brave enough, is those Greek citizens were on the whole much more educated than many citizens today in modern societies. And that, of course, is a vast indictment on our educational systems. The fourth point I'm going to make is that we need to explore the use of AI to enable more participatory, democratic approaches to decision-making. Okay, so it's not that AI is always just the problem, that AI may in fact be part of the solution to the problems and challenges it creates. So already such tools exist. We could use AI tools to help select members of citizen assemblies in a way that ensures that these citizen assemblies are sufficiently representative of a broader population. They can also help facilitate and moderate discussion. So Meta already has its various forums where it uses AI tools to encourage such deliberation and discussion. And also, these AI tools can help crystallize the outcomes of decisions. And a great example here is the government of Taiwan. The government of Taiwan has developed an online platform called Polis, which comes from the ancient Greek word for the state. On this platform, citizens address contentious issues. The platform is able to crystallize opinion and feed it into democratic decision-making processes in 30% or more of cases, leading to direct outcomes. So there's an irony here. The irony is that the discussion of AI regulation increasingly has the appearance of an exclusionary, technocratic forum that is disproportionately shaped by the preoccupations and interests of big tech companies. And moreover, when people do think about AI in relation to democracy, they often think of it in a negative way. They think about AI as something that enables micro-targeting and manipulation of people, that enables the spread of disinformation and misinformation. They think of it as something that aggravates the political polarization that exists in society, undermining the civility that's necessary for real deliberation. The irony is, there's another side to this. The other side is that AI tools could actually help us scale democratic deliberation in a much more effective way. But we haven't sufficiently explored it. Why? Well, I assume it's because it's not in the interests of those who are currently controlling the way in which this technology develops. Their interests seem to be increased surveillance, increased extraction of data from citizens, increased cost cutting, not improving services, but providing a similar service or slightly inferior service, but at much less cost. And the way to do that is by excluding humans, because they're the most expensive component in that chain of creating value. But these aren't the values that have been democratically endorsed, so far as I can see. They're the values of those who already control the levers of power and already have disproportionate wealth. It's imperative, I think, that we democratize these decisions for reasons that I've given in the past. As I've said, one is because democracies on the whole tend to make better decisions. Second, even if they don't, in any particular case, make a better decision or the best decision, there is value in the democratic process. I can accept a decision I don't fully agree with if I had a chance to participate in discussion, my voice was heard, but my fellow citizens, after deliberation, rejected that. I'm reconciled to that in a way that I'm not if my voice is stifled. But there's also a third thing that I want to emphasize, and it's something that's very obvious to many people now. We're living at a time where there's increased doubts and skepticism about democracy itself. And this includes in leading established democratic societies, especially amongst young people, there's disillusionment with democracy. And what's driving this? Well, it's very hard to make these sort of diagnoses, But I think we're caught in a kind of doom loop between two different tendencies. On the one hand, we have technocrats saying there are decisions only experts should make. These are not decisions for ordinary public. And this provokes a response from populists who say, we reject these experts, we are the true people, we're going to speak in the name of the real people. But the problem with that populism is it's often an exclusionary form of populism. It doesn't really represent the whole of the people. It's not really democratic. It often just represents a particular segment of the people. So the technocracy and populism of this unattractive sort feed off each other. And one thing they have in common is that they're both undemocratic. One says the experts must rule, the other says the real people must rule. And the way out, I think, of both those alternatives is this more radical democratic approach that we need to recover. And it could be that AI can help us get out of that situation. I'm going to conclude now with some final thoughts about universities. So I don't think universities, people like me, can stand and pontificate and tell people what decisions they can make. I think what we can do is simply try to improve the quality of the discourse around AI. Show people what the options are. Show them what our particular discipline has to say. And as in the first talk we heard today, this problem is not a problem for any one discipline. It requires many disciplines to come together, to talk amongst themselves, computer scientists and philosophers. That's one of the key things I've been doing at Oxford, ensuring that there's real discussion between philosophers and computer scientists, because otherwise, philosophers will go ahead and talk about crazy scenarios that bear no relationship to reality, and computer scientists will think they know what fairness means, but really what they mean by fairness is some kind of mathematical procedure that bears no real resemblance to the ethical quality of fairness that we care about. So we need to have that interdisciplinary discussion, and then we need, as academics, we have a responsibility as academics to try to bring that to a wider public in an as accessible form as possible. So what are we up against in this? As a philosopher, it's important for me to have a full understanding, as full as I can, of the range of values, the pluralism of values, as I talked about. But the AI discourse, which is in the hands very often of people trained in engineering and economics, has a certain bias. The bias I'm going to call outcome thinking. So as a good example of this, there was the head of Black & Decker, which is an American company that makes drills. And they would talk to their executives, and he would put up a picture of a drill. And he would say to his people, this is what we sell, right? And they would say, yeah, wrong. Puts up another picture, a hole in the wall. That's what we sell. So the thought is, the process doesn't matter. What matters is the outcome. Okay? So this is going to be a big mantra that we hear from tech companies. If you can get the result with AI, why does it matter to you that the process through which you get the result is very different from the process that a human would follow? One of the key things universities have to do is push back against this exclusively outcome-based thinking. Now, we saw this already when we think about the value of democracy. I said the value of democracy is partly about outcomes. Democracies tend to produce better results. Why? Because they draw on the cognitive diversity of their members. Because even the humblest person has an experience that the professor doesn't know about, but could be very relevant. But another reason is because the process is a respectful process of reaching a decision. So democracy is not just about outcomes. It's not just about the hole in the wall. It's about the process through which those outcomes are reached. Think about work. Why do you value work? Is it because of the outcome of a paycheck? Is it because you're producing something valuable that people want? Sure. That's part of it. But another part of it is a lot of people value their work because of the process of using their skills and abilities to engage with a difficult problem and to address that problem. If it was just about getting an income, we could say, when AI takes over all the jobs, we don't need to worry because we can have a universal basic income and there's no loss. But there is a loss. The loss is one of the great sources of achievement for most people in the world is work, the process of using their skills to meet difficult challenges. And simply be receiving a universal basic income isn't going to replace that. But if we think purely in terms of outcomes, there's no problem. Okay, last example. Are you happy for a robot to be the judge in your case, in court? Now, some people will say, look, we haven't got there yet. AI systems make too many mistakes. And this is one of the features of AI systems as they currently exist. Although they can be very efficient and be very surprising in delivering good results, AI systems also make mistakes that no human would ever make. They will identify a cat as a skateboard or a human as a gorilla. No human would ever make that mistake. All right, but let's just take them on their word. Say the AI system can produce correct judgments. Now, these guys are going to say, and they do say already, what's the objection now to having an AI judge? It produces the correct outcome. Human judges are often subject to bias. They produce different outcomes, incorrect outcomes, because of their bias, for example. They're biased against certain members of the public. And another feature, think about important cases like asylum decisions. Do you give asylum to someone? In America, in the asylum system, some judges allow 8% of applicants to have asylum. Other judges allow 88%. So if you're an asylum seeker, you feel like you're in a lottery. Depending on which judge you get, a life and death decision is going to be made. So these are powerful reasons, it seems, for saying, yeah, if you could have sound judgments, you'd have consistent judgments. Why would you need a human to decide? And again, now we have to ask ourselves, what's missing here? And a lot of what's missing is an issue of process. Maybe the outcome is correct, but the process, how was it arrived at? It was arrived at essentially by a statistical process of identifying statistical patterns. But these statistical patterns don't necessarily justify the outcome. There is an AI system that can predict the outcome of cases in intellectual property cases in America. And it's even more successful or just as successful as the most experienced intellectual property lawyer. But how does it predict these cases? Not on the basis of the law. It predicts them on the basis of the name of the judge, the name of the parties, the size of the claim. So it's taking all these irrelevant considerations, we would see as irrelevant to justifying the outcome, but using them to predict the correct outcome. We don't want just correct outcomes. We want correct outcomes for good reasons. We want something else as well. If someone's going to make a decision that I have to go to prison, or my children are taken away from me, or my property is taken away from me, I don't just want a correct decision. I want someone who can take responsibility for this decision. Who will say, yes, I'm standing here in front of you, taking responsibility for this decision that has tremendous impact on your life. No AI system that we know of or is likely to emerge anytime soon can take responsibility for decisions. And finally, perhaps most ineffably of all, I want the human solidarity of being able to engage with a decision maker who understands my human situation, who is also a human, who's also fallibly trying to figure out what's correct, And there's a certain kind of dialogue that exists between us that could not possibly exist with any AI system known to us. Again, we have to take on board the pluralism of values and not be beguiled into thinking there is only one thing that matters, the value of the outcome. Thank you very much.